Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf lamed daled. I'll return to our few quick announcements. Bookmarks. Please order your bookmarks. Registration's open till Sunday. You can order till the end of Sunday next week. And those are bookmarks for Seder Kodashim. For those who aren't familiar with the bookmarks, we make bookmarks as resource materials for the learners. They both have a checklist, so you can mark off all the dapim. They have for each masechet the key or a bunch of key terms that might help you through your learning. And obviously, it's a good bookmark to use in your Gemara, so you know always what page you're up to. And also, I'll be in America speaking both in New York and Long Island next week on Sunday and on Tuesday evening. Sunday evening and on Tuesday evening in Los Angeles. If you haven't yet seen the details, you can reach out to us and we will send you details if you're interested. It's a good opportunity to share with people you might know there, to get more people exposed to Hadran and maybe start learning the daf or just using any of all of our learning resources. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. At the end of daf lamed gimel, we have this section about Rav Zvid. We had this whole discussion about glazed earthenware vessels. So on the one hand, they're earthenware, they absorb. On the other hand, they're glazed, so they have a covering on them. Again, there was a debate about exactly, was it lead, was it something else? But they have some sort of coating on it, which means that perhaps they're not going to be so absorbent. So there was a debate about it. We saw Rav Zvid, who said it depends what color they are. If they're red or black, if they're white or black, then they're not going to absorb. But if they're green, they will, because the green is made of a substance that's very absorbent. So even though it has the glaze on top, it's still going to absorb. But Meriemar said it doesn't matter what kind. All the glazed ones do not absorb, and we don't have to worry about it. What don't we have to worry about? We don't have to worry about wine getting absorbed. So if we get one of these jugs, something with wine in it from an idol worshiper, we don't have to worry that there was nesach in it, because even if there was, it's not absorbed and it won't come out into our wine and give flavor. However, they said, but Meriemar seems to contradict himself, because Meriemar said somewhere else that they asked him, can you use glazed vessels on Pesach? Okay, so now they had chametz in them and you want to use them on Pesach. So then they clarified their question. They said, we're not asking about the green ones. Obviously, you can't use the green ones. And we're not asking about the black and white ones that had cracks and crevices. I forgot to mention that we also said if they have cracks and crevices, obviously they're going to absorb. Okay, I'm not asking about those either. We're talking about black and white smooth ones. They limit their question to just that. To which he answers them, Amar lehu, starting now on our daf, Ana chazina lehu de midaite. We see them. When you put stuff in there and you cook them up, the pot sweats. Okay? It's like there's liquid coming out of it, which means that it must be that, okay, exactly what this means, good question, but he says, since they sweat, kevan demidaite, vadai bale vasire. It clearly means it must be porous, like the way our bodies sweat and they're porous. So the vessels must be porous, even though they have this glaze. And therefore, they're forbidden, meaning you can't use them for Pesach. Right? So, my taima, and if you want to say maybe we could kasher them, the Torah says if you have a kli cheres, right, when it talks about the laws of kashering, it says if you have an earthenware vessel, you have to break it. There's nothing you can do to kasher it. So if you want to use a regular vessel from all year round, that's a glazed earthenware vessel, no, you can't, because it absorbs. You can't use it on Pesach. If you used it all year round, you don't have to break it because you could use it during the year, but you can't use it for Pesach. Okay, so he's very strict here. First of all, they didn't even ask him about the green. The green is obviously absorbent, and even the other ones, he still views them as absorbent. So how are you going to make this distinction? Explain this distinction that Meriemar chametz Pesach, he's so strict, right? It seems like he's totally contradicting what he says with the wine. Now the Gemara is going to suggest, so Mishna nesach dedarish Meriemar kulu mani dekun yashare. So what's the difference between Pesach and nesach? That there, Meriemar said they're all permitted. That would be a very easy answer. Chametz is Torah law. Nesach is a rabbinic ordinance, right? We want you to stay away from their wine, right? Maybe they offer it as a libation, but if you want to say that distinction, because it's D'Rabbanan, we're going to be more lenient and say they don't absorb.
But that doesn't make any sense, because how called the tikkun rabbanan ke'en de'oraita tikkun. This is not like let's be stricter, let's be more lenient. This is very different. This is the rabbis decreed on Yei Nesach. But now that means we're going to go back, though, when the rabbis make an ordinance and say something is forbidden, let's say for eating, so we're going to forbid it in all the ways other things are forbidden to eat. So if we say these kelim absorb, then the kelim absorb. They absorb the rabbinic prohibition, and they absorb the Torah prohibition. It doesn't make a difference. When the rabbis institute ordinances, they don't say, oh, well, for rabbinic law, we're going to say they don't absorb. For Torah law, they are going to absorb. That doesn't make any sense. So we're going to answer in a different way, which makes a lot of sense. This is used for hot, and that's used for cold. And as we know with kasherus, generally things absorb because of heat. When they absorb because of heat, we're going to say, and that was the whole thing you said about the sweating. They don't sweat when you put wine in them. They sweat when you heat them up. Okay? So when you apply heat and you put a fire on it, it's going to absorb differently than the way it's going to absorb by just wine sitting in the jug. The wine sitting in these earthenware vessels are not going to absorb over time because it's all cold and there's no heat that's going to cause some absorption to go on. But in chametz, Pesach, right, in general, what do we say about the absorbing? If it's in an earthenware vessel, earthenware absorbs, but not if it's glazed, right? And that's why it's going to absorb even if it's cold, but not when they're glazed. Glazed things don't. And that's his distinction, and that's how we make an easy answer for Meriemar seeming contradiction of his words. It's very different when you're talking about chametz on Pesach and other laws of kasherus from cooking than cold. And that's why we saw things that were different, like with the soaking, right? Soaking, it wouldn't work if it's something that you cook on the fire. Soaking only works for things that are never heated up. Okay. Rabbi Akiva ikla leginzak. Rabbi Akiva comes to the city of Ginzak. If you want to learn more about Ginzak and some of the etymology of also the word and all sorts of other words that are connected to Ginzak, you can read Flashback this week. But one thing that's really important to mention is Ginzak is in modern day Iran, okay, in Persia, and Rabbi Akiva goes to Ginzak, and in fact, Shuli talks about, you see it from Rabbi Akiva traveled a lot. One thing I wanted to point out, though, is if you look at the parallel sugya in Ta'anit, this comes up in Ta'anit, and you'll see in a minute why it comes up in Ta'anit, because Rabbi Akiva is going to be asked 3 questions. He doesn't have the answers. He goes into the beit midrash. There's a few problems with the story. Number 1, Ginzak is pretty far for Rabbi Akiva to travel. Number 2, how did Rabbi Akiva not know some basic answers to questions, right? So there's another issue about that. If you look at the parallel sugya in Ta'anit, comes up there on Ta'anit Yud Aleph, Amud Bet, the same story appears, but with Mar Ukva and not Rabbi Akiva. Mar Ukva was the exilarch in Babylonia. Now, for him to travel to Ginzak was a lot more realistic. And for him not to know answers to questions was also more likely than Rabbi Akiva not knowing the answers to these questions. And it's possible that that's a more accurate version of the story. You could see how people confused Akiva, Ukva, right? They seem similar, and it was obviously, obviously they're 2 very different people. But when the Sofer, the scribe, was, copying it, could be he got a little confused between Mar Ukva and Rabbi Akiva. Anyway, also they used Rashi Tevot and all that. Okay, let's start. In fact, here it appears Reish Ayin, which could be Rav Ukva. Okay, it's really Mar Ukva, but you could see how one can confuse that. Rabbi Akiva ikla leginzak ba'umidei mitanim l'shaot or ein mitanim l'shaot. This is a big question, what exactly this question is. I'm going to explain it one way, because it's not really our sugya, but when we get to Ta'anit, Bezrat Hashem, in a few years, maybe we'll go back to seeing the different explanations of this. But what this means, according to one explanation, is if I wake up one day and just don't eat, and then in the middle of the day I realize, I've already been like half day not eating, maybe I'll just take upon myself to fast the rest of the day. Is this a halachic fast or not? Am I obligated to continue finishing the fast till the end of the day? Is there such a thing? Generally, we say fasts have to be taken on the afternoon before. If you ever notice in some of the Sidurim, they have at the end of Shemona Esrei, you can add in, if you want to take upon yourself a Ta'anit for tomorrow, you have to add in by Mincha, I'm taking on a Ta'anit. It's really like a law of neder kind of thing. If I take a vow or to do something, right? Is this significant? The fact that I said, now I'm going to fast for the rest of the day, does it have validity or not? Lo hava biyadi, and he didn't know to answer the question. Kankanim shalavdei kochavim asurim or mutarim? jugs that we got from Ovdei Kochavim, from idol worshippers, are they forbidden or permitted? Now, this is a very strange question because the Mishna says very clearly. So machlok at Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, whether it's permitted, everyone forbids it for drinking, is it permitted to benefit from or not? But it seems like a pretty basic law, but we're going to see maybe what they mean is something a little different, because when they get to the answer, you're going to see that maybe the question wasn't exactly the way we thought. Lo hava biyadeh, he didn't know how to answer. B'meshimesh Moshe kol shivat yemei miluim. When Moshe worked in the temple on the 7 Yemei Miluim, okay, those were the days where they did the sanctification, the consecration of the temple, right, of the tabernacle. It was the, kind of the initiation. That's the word I was looking for. The initiation of the temple. There was a whole ceremony. Right, Parshat Shmini is Vayiba Yom HaShmini on the 8th day. So the 7 days of the Miluim, when he was bringing sacrifices, Moshe wasn't a Kohen, right? So, but he did bring sacrifices. So what did he wear? It's like a funny question, but it's really important because there were big day kuhuna, the inauguration. Thank you. That's the word, the inauguration. So what did he wear? Okay, lo hava biyadeh. He didn't know. So atashal beit midrash. So he goes into the beit midrash to ask the questions that he was asked by these other people. Amre, they said to him, Hilchata mitanim l'shaot ve'im shlim mitpalel tfilah ta'anit. Yes, you are mitanim l'shaot, and if you finish the day, and if you're still fasting, what this doesn't mean completely because we daven mincha time, but if you're still fasting at mincha time, then you even daven the prayer of the Ta'anit. If you remember, there were 6 blessings they would add for fast days, and also there's Hanenu. Okay, so you add that. So meaning, yes, it's an actual fast. V'hilchata kankanim shel avdei kochavim la'achar 12 chodesh mutarim. What this means is, if I didn't, let's say, do the kashering that we talked about, of putting them in water for 24 hours, 3 days in a row, switching the water each time. But I didn't. But I have these jugs over a year. I can already use them. If we know they haven't been used for wine for a year, I can already use them after a year. Why is that? Because we assume, right, again, this is different than regular kashered, which we don't say, oh, a year's passed, now I can just use it. But we say, right, you have to kasher those. But these, no, after 12 months, it's no longer has the flavor in it, right? Whatever flavor was in it, it's not going to give taste anymore. The whole idea is that this taste got absorbed. Remember, it was by cold, not by heat. It gets absorbed in a way that it just kind of dissipates over a period of 12 months. And Moshe Shivat Yemei Miluim b'chaluk lavan. He had a special white garment that he wore that was made for this purpose, and that's what he wore. Rav Kahana mane b'chaluk lavan she'ein bo imra. So it didn't have a hem. Okay, Rav Kahana says it was a white cloak that didn't have any hem. So by the way, I remind you of laws we saw that people, that particularly the big day kuhuna, didn't have hems on them, or certain things that when you go into our beit, you can't go with hems because there was worried there's money around there, people were going to steal the money and stick it in the hems of their garments. Some people say this has to do with it was made with one thread and it wouldn't tear, something like that. I don't know exactly, but there were possible reasons why to say it didn't have this hem in it. There's a whole Tosfot here about Moshe, and was he a Kohen, was he not a Kohen, and all that, and that's the topic of Gefet for this week from Bnei Yel Shimoni. I don't think it went up yet, maybe it did, but I didn't notice, but if it didn't, it will hopefully go up today, and you can listen to the extra shiur. So you have 2 things today. One is to read up about Ginzak, and one is about the Moshe being a Kohen or not. So now we're back to the Mishna, although you're going to see that we're going to connect back to this idea of the 12-month period that we mentioned before. But that's not why they're on this. They're on this because the Mishnah had said, we're back to the next line in the Mishnah. We keep just going along in the Mishnah in all these cases. We have the chartzanim and the zagim. These are the grape skins and the grape pits that were used in the wine press and have wine on them. So they're forbidden also because there's wine. Okay, so long as there's wine, it's going to be forbidden. But Chachamim said that lachim asurim yeveshim mutarim. If they're already dried out, then there's no wine on them and they're permitted. So now we're going to have a braita that says exactly that. Tanu Rabbanan, chartzanim v'azagim shel avdei kochavim lachin asurim yeveshim mutarim. If they're moist, they're forbidden because there's wine on them. If they're dry, they're not because there's no wine anymore. Heinenu lachin beheinu yeveshim. So what does it mean? Moist, dry. How do you define that, right? Obviously there's a range there of, starting to dry out, fully dried out. Where exactly does each one fall?
Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, lachin kol 12 chodesh. We go back to this year. If they're moist, that's considered a year after they've been used to make wine. For the whole first year, we're going to still consider them moist. They might have wine in them. This, by the way, the same idea. The wine after 12 months, even if there's something still there, it's not going to give flavor anymore. They're already considered dry after 12 months. Even if there's some dried out wine there and you put it in something, it's going to, the wine will come out. We don't consider that wine anymore. Itmar, it was said, Amar Rabbi Barbachanan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan was quoted as saying, Keshehem asurin afilu b'hana'ah, kshem mutarim afilu b'achila. He says in its extreme, it's complete, meaning the moist ones are forbidden completely, also to benefit, also, right, not just to drink, also to benefit. Notice here, this wasn't one of the cases where the rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Meir and said it's only forbidden to drink, not to benefit, right? They just came in and said it depends lach yavesh, and that was their disagreement with Rabbi Meir. But if they're lach, if they're moist still, they're forbidden completely, also to benefit, even according to the rabbis, because there's wine. And if they're dry completely. You can even drink those, you can eat them. It's fine. Amar Zvid, Hai Dordaya de Chamra Daramai. These are the dregs of the wine were used as yeast. So if you have yeast of an Aramean from the dregs of the wine, but Tartresa Yarchashata Shari. Also, after 12 months, it's already, this could be more like a chemical process. It goes through this chemical process of, it's a fermenting agent, and by 12 months later, it really is nothing. It's not wine anymore. Okay, it's just not. Amar Rav Chaviva Berei de Rava, and now we're going to have a list of a bunch of different rabbis saying that there's the following things that after 12 months you can use them already. Okay, this is the same idea of the 12 months we talked about before and the 12 months we talked about here with the chartzanim. There's other things, and now we had it with the fermenting agents from the wine. Now we're going to have it with other things as well. Hane golfe, okay, this is similar to what we talked about before. Golfe is an earthenware vessel, an earthenware jug. But chatresi achashata shari. After 12 months, it's permitted. This goes with what we saw before about the kankanim. It's really no different. Amar Rav Chaviva, Hane Avata, turning now to Amabet, Detaye, the Avata of the Arab merchants, but chatresi achashata shari. After 12 months, they're permitted. What is Avata? I specifically didn't translate it when I first read it. What is Avata? Rashi says it's a wineskin from a thick leather. Okay, and then we're basically saying, right, the previous one talked about earthenware, and this is wine, okay, and that's what it is. Tosfos says it's akata, it's not avata, and he says that's what the Aruch has. The Aruch was like the earliest dictionary from the 11th century, and earliest Aramaic dictionary, and he says it's actually food, okay, it's a food. It has nothing to do with wine, something that holds wine. He says, "Mevi'im kemach." I'm in Tosfot. Ve'asavim ubsamim v'shorin otam b'chalav u'mizalfim yayin alehem. So you make this concoction with a bunch of ingredients, and then you pour some water on top. You pour some wine on top. So again, it's one of these things that has wine mixed in. But if you leave it for 12 months, forget about it getting moldy. Somehow, I don't know, it didn't get moldy. But if you leave it for 12 months, it's already the wine taste in it is not wine anymore, and you can eat it. Rabbeinu Hananel, he quotes, has afta, and it's milashon avatiach, which is watermelon. But he says avatiach, he actually translates it as dalat chalulai. He gets from avatiach to gourds. Okay, I guess avatichim aren't necessarily watermelons. Okay, I think we see this also in the Torah when they talk about the avatichim that they remember eating in Egypt. I don't think people think those are watermelons, if I remember correctly. So they say it's a gourd that they hollowed out, and they used it for wine. So they end up, it's like a combination of it was a food, but it was food used to carry wine. Okay, either which way, whatever this is, after 12 months, it's okay. I'm Rav Acha Berei de Rav Ika, Hane Portsane de Aramai, okay, which Rashi says is the psolet of Anavim. It's the stuff you usually throw away. It could be, again, the grape skins or something like that. But Tartresi Achashata Shari, this matches what we saw about the Chatzanim and the Zagim, right? The grape pits and the grape seeds. After 12 months, they're considered dry. There's no wine in them, and you can eat them. Amar Rav Acha Berei de Rabba, Hane Golfe Shechime ve'ukame. These are red and black jugs. But Tartresi Achashata Shari. Why is it different if they're red and black? So again, why are they different in color? Some people think because they were made from different kinds of substances. And by the way, they're not different. They're just pointing out, they're not any different. And they're like any golfe, right, which we said after 12 months. It could be just this is a different statement by a different person. It's no different than the golfe we talked about before. Okay, some people say the red and black, why are they red or black? How do they change color? They didn't start red and black. Okay, so again, either they started red and black because they were made from soil that was darker or redder. But it could be they were red and black, some people say, because they absorbed the wine. And now what the chidush is, even though you looks like, right, let's say they started out white and now they turn red and black because they absorbed the wine, even though it looks like there's wine absorbed and you can see it, but after 12 months, you don't taste it anymore, so it doesn't even matter. So it doesn't matter if you can see that wine is absorbed in there, it's still going to be permitted after 12 months. And this is all, by the way, if you didn't soak them. We already had the soaking solution, which would have worked more immediately, but you have to soak them. If you didn't soak them and just 12 months passed, you don't need to do any process to them. They're already permitted. Now we're back to the next part of the Mishna, which is the morayis, the fish stew. Okay, the next line in the Mishnah, let's just read it again, and then this will get us actually, we'll read from here to the end of the Mishnah, because this is going to take us to the next section. We have the morayis and the gvinat beit unyaki of Avodah kochavim, that again, Rabbi Meir says they're forbidden, and Isuran, and the rabbis say they're not, right? They're only forbidden to eat, but not, or to drink, but not to, actually these are both eating, but not for benefit. Now, the morayis was a fish stew, and it had wine in it, and that's why it's forbidden. The cheese, if you remember, we went into this whole long thing, and that's how we ended our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda said that Rabbi Yishmael asked Rabbi Yoshua why this is, why are they forbidden? He said because they make them in the stomachs of nevelas, right? Animals that weren't slaughtered. To which Rabbi Yishmael said, I don't understand. Why should the stomach of the nevela forbid it when nevela in general is permitted to benefit from, right? And the ola, which is not permitted to benefit the kohanim, if they wanted to, they could drink from whatever they found in the stomach of the animal, right? From the fat that's in there. And there we don't forbid it to benefit from. So how can we explain that? To which he said, fine, I'm going to change it. It's not that. It's that they would make the cheese using the stomachs, right? The enzymes from the stomach of an animal that was worshipped, the Avodah Zarah. Okay, and then he says, well, then why don't they forbid it to benefit from? To which he said, oh, I'm going to get off topic, and he switches the topic and doesn't really want to say why they're forbidden to benefit from. Okay, that's the end of the section. We're going to come back to all this, and that's why I wanted to just read it now. So first morayis, and then we'll get to the cheese. Morayis. Tanu Rabbanan. Morayis uman mutal. He says if it's a specialist who prepares it, it's permitted. Why is that? Because the specialist didn't use wine. We're going to see this in a minute, why that is, but let's keep going. Rabbi Yehuda ben Gamliel, Omer Mishum Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel, af chilik uman mutal. Also, the chilik of an uman, if a specialist is permitted, as this basically means if you do it in your own house, someone made it in their house, and it's an idol worshiper who made it, you can, avoid it because they probably put wine in there. But if you went to like a specialty store or there was someone who made it, what's defined exactly as an uman is a good question, but it was a chef who made it, then it's permitted. Also chilik. Chilik we're going to get to later in the Mishnah, which is, it was a small fish that they would often catch other fish with it. And then when they prepared it, they often had other fish mixed in. Now, chilik is kosher. But we're concerned that if someone who didn't know what they were doing, or someone who didn't care so much, like they weren't Jewish, so they didn't care if it was kosher or not, would often mix into the chilik some of these other fish that they caught at the same time. And therefore, it was considered, you have to avoid the chilik of non-Jews. The chilik of an uman, you don't have to worry about because they're very careful. They're not going to mix in other things to their chilik. They take their chilik very seriously. They're not going to mix in other things. There's a few other interpretations of what this chilik is, but we're going to go with that. Tani Avimi bereid Rabbi Avav. So now Rabbi Avimi brings this brayta that says morayis uman mutal, and now he explains hu tani la hu amrala. He recited the brayta and then he explained it. Right? Often we had these people who recited braytot. That was like their job, and it was in order to keep these braytot alive, and people would recite them. And sometimes it was just reciting, but sometimes they explained them. So he recited the brayta and then he explained it. Pam rishon v'sheni mutal, shlishi asur. The first, right, this was a stew that they would apparently soak, like the morayis, in stuff. And the first time, and the first round and the second round, it's going to be permitted. The third of the uman, though, it's going to be forbidden. We can assume by the third stage, or if it went through a few stages, they're going to put wine in. Okay, that doesn't really help us yet. My timer, what's the reason? Pam rishon v'sheni the nafesh shumanayhu lo tzarich, or it's really not lo tzarich. It should be you shouldn't. Lemirme behu chamra. The first and the second time, if you put wine in, it's very fatty, the morayis. And when you're soaking it the first or second time, if you add the wine, it's going to ruin the morayis. So the uman, who either knows this, and that's why they're not going to do it, and the average person might not know it, or the average person usually makes it for eating that day. So it's not going to ruin it. It's going to ruin it over time if you leave it. The uman is making it to sell, presumably, and to last for a while, so they wouldn't add the wine because the wine would ruin it. By the third time, then already the fat of the morayis is out of there. And then because, this is some chemical interaction between the wine and the fat is a bad interaction and will ruin it. Once it's not fatty anymore, then you can add the wine and it won't ruin it. And these are dapim, really, understanding chemistry is probably very useful for these dapim. So another story about morayis. There was a boat full of morayis. It gets to the Gulf of Akko, and what's going to happen here is it obviously came from the north. We're going to see because it passed through Lebanon on its way. Came from somewhere in the north. Okay, we don't know where, but it seems like they knew where. And Otiv Rabbi Ahmad bin Akko Nitora Bahada. Rabbi Abba puts up a shomer. Now the boat arrives. There's morayis in it. He puts up someone to watch it to make sure that no idol worshippers add wine to it. Amarle, okay, they say Rava, it shouldn't be Rava, could be just they said to him, and then it should be Rabbi Abba. That's what the Bach says. Rabbi Abba, they asked Rabbi Abba, until now who was watching it. What does it help you to start watching it now? It's morayis. That came from who knows where, probably from idol worshippers. Can't you just assume that they put in already wine? So how's that going to help you that we only start putting up someone to watch it now? Who knows what happened before? Shouldn't we be worried about that? What are we worried about before? If you're worried they're going to put wine in, that they put wine in, no way did they put wine. And he's going to give an economical, an answer of like an economist, basically. He says, or I don't know, an economist, but it has to do with the market. Kista de morayis beluma, kista de chamra ba'arba alume. In the place where this came from, which we don't know where. The price of a kista, which seems to be a measurement of morayis, is a luma. It's also some sort of coin, okay, or amount of money. It's a luma. For that same amount of wine, it's 4 luma. The price of wine is 4 times the price of morayis, which means nobody in their right mind is going to add wine to morayis because you're basically dumping money, right? You're wasting your money by putting something that's worth 4 times the amount that's going to now be sold for a quarter of the amount. You would never do that. So there's no chance, for economic reasons, that anyone put wine in here until this point. Now, remember Rabbi Yirmiyah, our favorite Rabbi Yirmiyah, who always loves to ask these questions. So Rabbi Yirmiyah comes up with a good question. Amarle Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zarah. Dilma aide ditzor atu deshabe chamra. But wait, in Sur, which is in Lebanon, so it might have stopped there on the way. And if they stopped in Sur, well, it's the same as here, where the price of wine is the same as the price of morayis. And therefore, right, the assumption was obviously, I didn't say this, but where we are in Akko, the price is the same, and therefore there's a concern they're going to put wine in the morayis. But in Sur, it's the same as here, where the price is the same. And therefore, don't you have to worry that maybe they docked in Sur on the way and, maybe needed, refueling. Okay, fuel in those days. But whatever reason, they stopped for food or something. And maybe somebody added wine to the morayis there. Amarle, hatam ikule upashuri ika. No. There, the water's very rough, and also it's because of the pashure, which is, the mountains have snow on them, and the snow drips down, the melted snow, it causes the waters to be very rough, and because of that, there's no chance that they docked in Sur. It's like impossible to dock there, which is very interesting, because they talk about boat travel from Sidon to Sur, comes up in the Shabbat Sugya, so I don't know why he claims this, but he claims that, there's no place for your question, Rabbi Yirmiyah, because there's no chance they docked in Sur. Okay. Now we're moving on to the Gvinat Beit Unyaki Sugya. I'm a Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So first we're going to deal with something Rish Lakish says, and we're going to have a contradiction and try to resolve the contradiction between what Rish Lakish says about this and what he seems to say somewhere else. And before that, we're going to have to sort of clarify what he's saying. I'm a Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Why did they forbid the gvinat onyaki? What the Mishnah leaves out is they say the gvinat ben onyaki is forbidden. Why? Because they make it from agalim of Avodah Zarah. But now he says, why specifically onyaki? Well, because most of the agalim, in other words, they make it using the rennet from the animals, these agalim, okay, these what do you call them? Calves that are worshipped for idols. So now, like, what's different about onyaki than any other place? Well, what's different about onyaki is the majority of the agalim, of the calves, of otah ear, of the ear of onyaki, are nishchatim l'avodah zarah, or slaughtered for the purposes of idol worship. Okay? That's what makes the cheeses of onyaki different from any other cheeses, because in this place, the majority, and we always go by majority, right? We have to worry about the majority. Okay, so the majority are idol worshippers. Well, now the question is, my area rov agalim, afilu miyut nami. They say, by the way, why did he have to say the majority? Even if the minority were being worshipped, it would be a problem. Why? This is famous. We've seen this in a number of sugyot. Rabbi Meir is concerned, and he's the one who appears in our Mishnah besides the rabbis, but Rabbi Meir also, who forbade this. He's always worried, even for small minority possibilities. So even if it was a minority of agalim, of calves that are worshipped for Avodah Zarah in the city, it should be forbidden as well. So why did Rish Lakish specifically say majority? To which he answers, a seemingly strange statement, rov ika miut. If you say majority, then you'll end up with a minority. Okay, what on earth does that mean? Okay, so you have to understand what they're talking about. What they mean is, now, cheese was made from using the rennet in the stomachs of the animals. But it wasn't only, they didn't only use calves, they used any animals. So now we're going to explain that majority of calves ends up being a case of minority altogether here. Because we have two sets. We have a set of animals, and then we have calves, which are part of the animal set. And then within the calves, so maybe it's from a calf, maybe it was prepared in a different animal. That's already reduces it to, the minority are calves, let's say, right? So maybe it was taken from a calf. And if it was taken from a calf, well, the majority of calves were used for idol worship. So that turns it into a minority. So that's why if there's a majority, then it'll be considered a minority. But you'll see where they're going. But if you say only a minority of the calves were used, since most of the calves aren't used for idol worship, and there's also the rest of the animals that aren't actually slaughtered for idol worship purposes because it was only the calves. Well, then you're ending up with a minority of a minority, because maybe it was taken from the calves, which are only a minority of all the animals, and of those calves, only a minority of them were used for idol worship. And then then Rabbi Meir wouldn't forbid. So the only reason it would be forbidden is because the minority of calves. Because again, you have to remember what they're not telling you is that the majority, it's only the calves that we use for idol worship, not all the rest of the animals. And since the cheese could have been prepared in any of the animals, we end up, the majority becomes a minority, and if it was a minority, it would have been a minority of a minority, which wouldn't forbid, even according to Rabbi Meir. Okay, that was the first thing we had to do, which is just clarify the words that Rish Lakish said, majority. Why do you have to say majority? Now we understand why. But now we're going to bring the contradiction. Amalei Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim, the Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakish. Rabbi Shimon bar Eliakim questions Rish Lakish from what Rish Lakish himself said. But even if you use these animals for worship, you slaughter them for the purposes of Avodah Zarah, you actually permit this yourself. You say those animals are permitted to benefit from. Why? Well, let's see. To Itmar, it was said that you actually argue with Rabbi Yochanan about this. He's the one who forbids and you permit. Hashochet et habema. What does it mean, by the way, to slaughter an animal for Avodah Zarah? Usually you slaughter an animal. Let's take our temple. What do? You slaughter an animal. The slaughtering is not the important part. The slaughtering is what we call a machshir. it allows the next stage to happen. Without the slaughtering, you can't have blood. Without the blood, you can't sprinkle the blood on the altar. Without sprinkling the blood on the altar, you can't offer the parts of the animal on the altar. So the slaughtering is just enabling all the rest of it to happen. So the slaughtering in itself is not important. It's only important as it allows you to have the blood, and then the blood can be sprinkled on the altar, and the parts of the animal can be burned on the altar. They're supposed to be burned. So if you're shochet behema, lizrok dama l'avodah zarah. So why are you slaughtering this animal to worship for the idols? Let's say you slaughter the animal with the intent that you plan to sprinkle the blood on the altar, or with the intent laktir chaba l'avodah zarah, to offer the fats on the altar for the idols. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura, he says this is forbidden. In other words, just the slaughtering itself, once it's slaughtered, before you've done the second stage of offering it, just the slaughtering itself turns this into tikrovet avodah zarah. It's already something offered to the idol, even though it hasn't yet been offered. All it's done has been slaughtered. That's not offered. It's just slaughtered with the intent. Now remember, we talked about this in Korbanot. Intent is critical. Okay, we'll learn this right in the beginning of Zvachim. So if I'm in the temple, let's say, and while I'm slaughtering, I think to myself, this is what pigul is. I'm going to sprinkle the blood outside the temple. Okay, that disqualifies the korban completely, even though I haven't sprinkled the blood outside the temple. Just the thought when I'm slaughtering and I'm doing one of the actions. Okay, there's 4 main actions in the sacrifice: slaughtering, accepting the blood in a vessel, walking the blood to the altar, and offering it on the altar. And then, right, it's the haktara is basically, it's also the sprinkling the blood on the altar. There's the zrika, there's the burning of the objects on the altar. Anyway, the main thing here is that in our world of the temple, thoughts I have during slaughtering disqualify the korban. So comes Rabbi Yochanan and says, same thing here. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan says, with the intent. Okay, an idol worshiper has the intent, I'm going to sprinkle the blood for the avodah zarah, for the idol, or laktir chaba l'avodah zarah, to burn parts of it for the idol. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Asura, kasavar machashvim me'avodah l'avodah v'yalfinan chutz mipnim. He says the intent you have in one of the actions, right, one of the parts, affects other, right? If you're thinking about some other one, you can, while you're slaughtering, you think about Srika, it's a problem, okay? Because we learn chutz mipnim, because the rules for what's considered avodah zarah are learned from our rules in our temple. So it's a fascinating concept. So if this would be pigul for us, this would mean that in their case, just the slaughtering alone creates a situation where this was like it was worshipped to the idol, even though it was never brought in front of the idol. We hadn't yet sprinkled the blood. We hadn't yet burned the parts. Okay? That's what he's saying. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar muteret. Shimon ben Lakish says it's permitted. So now he says, why? Because he doesn't learn chutz mipnim. He says there's no significance to slaughtering until you actually do an action of sprinkling to the idol. In idol worship, it's not learned from our temple. We have our own unique laws. Idol worshippers, it goes by their laws. In their rule book, right, slaughtering doesn't do anything yet. Slaughtering is just enabling the later process. You haven't offered it to the idol yet. So how could you possibly say that these cheeses are forbidden because they're using the rennet from the animals that were basically slaughtered for what purpose? Well, we're assuming slaughtered in order to later offer them on the temple, right, on the altar. So in the idol temples. So it says you totally contradict yourself. This Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says to Rish Lakish, to which Rish Lakish answers, Amalach Tarminach Shatach, which is all different interpretations of what this means. It's basically an insult. And he's saying, I hope your luck gets better. Like, you clearly don't know what you're talking about. Be'omer b'gmar zvicha hu ovdam. Talking about a case where someone slaughtered it. Now, in order for Rish Lakish to resolve the contradiction, he has to clarify his original statement. I didn't mean someone slaughters, that most of those calves are slaughtered for the purposes of offering them on the altar. No, I'm talking about, this is a case where the most of the people slaughter their animals and immediately bring it to the gods. In other words, the slaughtering is the process of creating the tikrovet. It's not slaughtering to sprinkle the blood. It's not slaughtering to burn something on the altar. It's slaughtering immediately then, right? It's part of the process of the slaughtering
is already offering it straight to the gods. So that's why this is not comparable to Mechashvim Avodah Lavodah. We're not talking about Avodah Lavodah. We're talking about in the slaughtering itself, it's already offered as a tikrovet, as a gift to the gods. Okay, so we've resolved Rish Lakish, and now we're moving on. I'm a Rabbi Yehuda Sha'al Rabbi Yishmael. Now we're going to that part where Rabbi Yishmael ends up in this whole discussion, and we get to the innards of the nevela versus the innards of the, right, and then the whole discussion there. So first, we're going to not get back to our Mishnah really today, so we're going to go outside the sugya for a minute. Amrav Achdavoy Amar Rav. HaMekadesh beperesh shor haniskal mekudesh. We're going to have a pretty disgusting sugya. Why you would do this, I hope you don't do this at your wedding. A man betroths a woman using the feces of a shor haniskal. What's a shor haniskal? It's a shor that gored and killed a person, and it needs to get stoned, and it's forbidden to benefit from. Now, if feces came out of that animal, and a person used it, now remember, okay, in those days they actually used this stuff, okay? We just talked about there were clay glalim, right? There were kelim they made of this, okay? It was used for all sorts of purposes, fertilizer, other things. So if a man uses it to betroth a woman, I don't know if this really ever happened, but they're just trying to use the betrothal as an example of, is this effective? We use this in a lot of cases, but they talk about if a man betrothed their wife with that, right? We talked about stuff that belongs to the Kohen, right? The Kohen gets a gift, it becomes the Kohen's, that they could even betroth a woman with it. It's their property. Okay, so this is just a litmus test for does this work? So if you use the perish of a shor haniskal, and a man betroths a woman with it, she's betrothed. What this basically means is the feces that comes out of the animal doesn't have the same law as the animal itself, because the feces is considered, and this comes up in a whole sugyot, as a distinct part of the animal. It's not a part of the animal. It's not like a limb of the animal. It's a separate thing that gets created in the animal and leaves the body of the animal, so it's considered independent. Okay, that makes perfect sense. However, beperished eglei avodah zarah ina mekudeshet. But if he uses this from the feces of an animal that was used for idol worship, it doesn't work. So now we have to understand the difference. Ibait ema svara, ibait ema cha. You can either learn it from logic or you can learn it from a pasuk. Ibait ema svara. Why? Gabei glazed avodah zarah nichale benavche. When an animal has the feces inside, it makes the animal more bloated, bigger. Now, in Avodah Zarah, what do you want? When you want to offer something to an idol, you want it to look the nicest possible. So the nefach, the bigger volume of the animal, is actually a benefit. Okay? And that's why you're actually benefiting from the fact that the feces is inside for the purposes of idol worship, and that's why we're going to forbid it. But kabei shorin is kal, but an ox that gored, that needs to be killed, and is forbidden to benefit from, obviously, lo nichale benavche, it has no bearing. It's a material, whether it's heavier, less heavy, it has no effect whatsoever. And that's why we can, theoretically, it's really considered separate, like I said before. But when it comes to Avodah Zarah, because the separate is actually benefiting the idol worshiper, so it's going to be considered forbidden. Ibait emakra, here's a pasuk, ktiv hacha lo yidbak biyadcha mu'uma min hacherim, right? That's don't benefit at all from anything of Avodah Zarah. So that's what we'll say, feces included. But ktiv hatan sako yiskel ashur v'leyachel b'saro. These are, by the way, the psukim that prove that they're forbidden to benefit from. The ox should be gored, should be stoned, sorry. V'lo yachel b'saro, and you can't eat the meat. So what do you see here? B'saro asur, ha'pirsho muter. You can't eat the meat. Doesn't mean you can't eat the feces. The feces is excluded from this pasuk. I'm a Rav, and we're only going to start here. I'm not going to really explain this, but Rav is going to say, Travayu Tananu. Both these things, by the way, is a quote Rav likes to use in a bunch of places in Shas. Both of these you can actually find source for in our Mishnah. Okay, and he's going to say, and they're basically going to say that you can benefit from the stomach of the nevela or the ola, and then we're going to compare that to Avodah Zarah, and then they're going to say it's because it's Avodah Zarah. In Avodah Zarah, you can't. And that's going to show the same distinction. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and we'll get back to that tomorrow. What have we done today's stuff? We started with the glazed vessels. From there, we got to all sorts of vessels and what you can, right, how they can be kashered. Do they need kashering? Can they be kashered? Waiting, we really talked about the 12-month waiting period. We saw that in a bunch of different sugyot. The chartzanim and the zagim, they dry out. Also, the wine is no longer after 12 months. We got to the yeast that was made from the wine, or the fermenting agent. Then we had a whole list of different rabbis commenting on different things the 12-month waiting period works for. And from there, we got to the morayis,
And then we had the story on the boat with the morayis, and the difference between the uman and a regular person, whether there's wine in it. There's some cases where we'll be concerned for wine. If there's no concern for wine, then obviously this morayis is totally fine. And from there we got to the cheese. We have Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rish Lakish's explanation. Number one, we had to explain why he had to say rov and not miut. Miut should also, but rov is miut, we basically explained. And then, because there's two sets, there's all animals, and then there's the calves. And then we had this contradiction of Rish Lakish, which we resolved, and then we got into this other halacha, a distinction between the feces of a shor and a skal and of an animal who was used for idol worship. And we came up with two explanations for the distinction, either through psukim or through logic. And then Rava is going to say we can find source for that in our Mishna as well. From there, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.